I am a beadaholic. I've been a beadaholic for years. I suspect that some of you are beadaholics as well. I love to string beads, weave beads, wire work with beads. There's something about beads. You gotta have them, you gotta play with them. And when you learn a little bit more about beads, their history and how they're used, it makes working and playing with them that much more meaningful. After all, the world of beads is absolutely magical. It's a fantastic journey that has no end. There are gemstone beads, there are pearls, check glass, and I don't want to forget about bone and wood or porcelain and those bright and shiny crystals. Beads are an obsession. When you look at beads and their use in jewelry, the feelings can be absolutely overpowering, spiritual, inspirational. Beads have this power over us because we can sense and experience and anticipate how these beads capture and control the light and shadow all around us. And we want that power for ourselves. We want the power to manipulate light and shadow, color, texture, beauty, and appeal. Arranging beads into bracelets and necklaces and ornamentation lets us have some of this power. And this obsession with beads and about beads and for beads drives us to want to learn more about them and how they're used. My name is Warren Feld. I'm a jewelry designer. I've dedicated the last 30 years of my life to beads and their use in jewelry. I've made some wondrous pieces of jewelry and some not so wondrous pieces. I make jewelry for family and friends, and I make jewelry for clients and some celebrities. But I can tell you firsthand that it does not take 30 years to get hooked. It happens in an instant. You realize that a life lived with beads and jewelry is a life lived with wearable art. Today I want to talk a little bit about the history of beads and the different ways that people use them. Beads are used in every culture in the world. They've been used throughout time. They're not necessarily used in the same ways or for the same reasons. Sometimes beads are used instead of money. When people look at beads, they have a certain intrinsic value that people seem to recognize and share. In a lot of places, people have more confidence in using the beads as their money instead of their own coins and currency. In a similar way, beads are used in trade. This is more true historically than today, but a little bit today. When two groups want to trade with each other, it's really hard to come to terms. Because for some reason people can come to an agreement on the value of beads, beads are used in various ways in the negotiation process. If you go back 300, 400, 500 years ago, you had European explorers, and they set out from different European countries and went to China and India and Africa and North and South America. They brought with them what we call trade beads, but at first they didn't trade them, they just gave them away as gifts. Trade beads are glass beads, and they're made in Venice, Bohemia, and the Netherlands. And people in Europe at that time, they looked down on glass beads. To them, glass was trash. They would never ever use glass in jewelry. They primarily used these glass beads in tapestry projects where they could get a more three-dimensional look with the glass than they could with the fibers. And these explorers, they just assumed that wherever they went, people would also look down on the glass beads. But when they got to these places, people really liked them. In China, they thought they were very spiritual. So these explorers stopped giving them away as gifts and started trading them. When the explorers came to North America, the Indians here wanted blue beads because they couldn't make the color blue with the natural materials they were using. The explorers were really happy about this. It turns out that blue is the cheapest color to make, so the explorers were doing really well in the trading. After a while, however, the Indians met their needs for blue, and they started asking for yellow and red. It takes real gold to make the colors yellow and red, so the trading got a lot tighter. Another way people use beads is for reasons of power. People with the more beads have the more power. And when you're in beading, you learn that very quickly. About 400 years ago, among the Oglala Sioux Indians in the Dakotas, there was a big women's movement. The women wanted more control over tribal matters. They saw an opportunity to assert themselves, and they won. And this whole thing was oriented around beads. So about 400 years ago, you have French traders. They came down through Canada, went down into the Dakotas, and they brought with them these trade beads, and they traded them for pelts. One of the major roles of women in Indian tribes was to make beads, and they'd spend all day every day making beads out of stones and antlers and wood and shells. When these French traders came with these pre-made beads, it freed up a lot of time. In this one group, the women took advantage of that time. One of the things they did to show that they won is they changed the costuming of the men. Before the movement, the men wore bead embroidery strips stacked down linearly along their sleeves. After the movement, they just stacked down part of it and let the rest flow out like a ribbon. So when the men were off to war hunting, whatever they did, they wore the mark of the women because the ribbons would flow. Another way people use beads is for reasons of adornment, just to make themselves look more beautiful. Among the Ndebele tribes in South Africa, these are women you probably know, they wear metal plates to stretch their necks. They developed a very beautiful stitch called the Ndebele stitch, and the only reason was to make themselves look more beautiful. On the screen is a picture of a sample of the Ndebele stitch. Very beautiful, very elaborate. Another way people use beads is for religious and spiritual reasons. You can picture a rosary in the Catholic Church. By going down this bead chain, it helps people feel closer to God. It helps them remember the ritual. In Buddhism, they use something like a rosary. In Confucianism in China, they use something like a rosary called immortal beads. During the Middle Ages in Europe, only priests were allowed to wear rosaries and have beaded adornments. They had all their parishioners make them rosaries and beaded this and beaded that. After a while, the priests with the more rosaries and the more elaborate rosaries had higher status, and the priests kept accumulating and accumulating and accumulating. At one point, one of the popes felt very threatened because the priests were getting as adorned as he was. So he issued an edict that said everyone can wear rosaries and have beaded adornments. So the fact that you can wear beaded jewelry today, instead of making them for your minister or pastor or whatever, goes back to the insecurity of one of those popes. The last way people use beads is for reasons of communication. Different colors have different meanings, different patterns have different meanings. Among the Zulu tribes in South Africa, you had a colonial period and an apartheid period that's about 70, 80 years. You had some tribes who adopted Christianity and identified with the colonialists, and others that did not. And the ones that did not developed a very elaborate communication system using beads. Besides what color was next to each other, they used a lot of triangles in their patterns. It's important if the triangle faced down or up, and again what the colors were. So they go home at night, they might do a beaded hat, a beaded doll, a beaded loincloth, a necklace, a blanket, something beaded. They come out during the day, they'd flash it. It might say something very general, like I'm mad at the world today, or it might get very specific, like I'd like to get together with you tomorrow night at 8, but not before I've met with your brother. They kept up this communication system all during this sort of 70, 80 year period. When apartheid ended, no one carried on the tradition. Today, Zulu beadwork's very fashionable, particularly in Europe, but no one knows what they're saying, they're just doing pretty patterns. Beading in America today is also part of a social movement that started around 1960. In 1960, 2 new stringy materials were developed and adapted by fine craftsmen. The first was called Nemo thread. Nemo is developed by the shoe industry to attach the bottom of your shoe to the top of your shoe. It's widely used in upholstery. The other material was called tiger tail. Tiger tail is a nylon-coated, flexible cable wire. Cable wires are wires that are braided together and encased in nylon. Before 1960, people strung things either on silk or cotton thread or on nylon fishing line. Silk and cotton naturally deteriorate in 3 to 5 years, and fishing line in ultraviolet light and heat dries out and cracks. So before 1960, there really was not a durable stringy material, and beading, historically for the most part, was just a home craft. It didn't attract artists, it didn't attract academics, it didn't attract fine craftsmen. It didn't really encourage people to really explore the craft and push the envelope with the craft. And when you look at beadwork historically, occasionally you do see some elaborate beadwork. And usually when you see it historically, it was done by people who were serfs or slaves or indentured servants. You see French beaded purses in the 1920s. France passed labor laws in the late 30s, and there are no more purses. You see Russian bead embroidery in the 1800s. They deposed the Tsar, and there's a rapid decline in Russian bead embroidery. A rational person is not going to spend all this money on beads and take all this time to make something if it's going to fall apart. So it really wasn't until the early 1960s that there were some alternatives. They were adapted by fine craftsmen. This movement started in Southern California and just gradually worked its way across the country. The fact that you can get excited about beads today, even thinking about selling things, 40 years ago you wouldn't have had those thoughts. You've looked down on beading. And beading as a craft discipline has a very different energy and dynamic to it than a lot of other crafts because it's very new to being considered more of an art form. Now, it's important when you work with beads and other materials to make jewelry that you know a lot about the quality of the pieces you're using and what happens to them over time. And that's the topic of our next presentation. Thank you.